In their heyday, circus trains were one of the greatest sights in America. They were such big events that shops, factories, and even schools would close early just so people had the chance to go and visit when the circus arrived in town. As magical as they were, however, circus trains weren't always safe. Derailments and shunting accidents were quite common on American railroads, and combined with handling dangerous animals, pieces of large heavy equipment, and cramped living spaces, it's no wonder circus trains had a reputation for being dangerous. Though out of all the incidents involving circus trains, none may be more infamous than the accident that took place in Hammond, Indiana in 1918. Born in 1847, Benjamin E. Wallace grew up to become the owner of a very successful livery business and lumber yard in Peru, Indiana, but held greater ambitions of one day running his own circus. He and business partner James Anderson began buying equipment and gathering acts until eventually, in 1884, both managed to officially open their own circus. Named Wallace & Co.'s Great World Menagerie, Grand International Mardi Gras, Highway Holiday Hidalgo, and Alliance of Novelties. The show became a massive success, and soon Wallace took full ownership of the circus, buying out and absorbing another show in 1907, renaming the new show the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus. By this point, it had become the third largest circus in the United States and required at least 2 separate trains to transport everything from town to town. Carnival life, however, wasn't a safe one. 2 rail accidents in 1903 resulted in 37 fatalities, with many performers getting injured, and a flood in 1913 caused the loss of many animals and expensive equipment. Nonetheless, the show carried on. In June 1918, the troupe had finished performing in Michigan City and were getting ready for their next gig at Indiana Harbor. The circus was split up into 2 trains, the first one mostly carrying animals, while the second mostly carried carnival crew, performers, and the remaining equipment. The cars used by the circus weren't by any means outdated, but still had wooden bodies, were lit with gas, and in need of repair. Both trains set off on the night of the 21st of June, the animal train running ahead of the crew train. At some point during the journey, an axle box on one of the crew train's flat cars started to run hot, and so the train had to be shunted into a siding in Ivanhoe near Gary, Indiana to resolve the issue. A few cars at the rear of the train were still on the main line, 4 passenger cars carrying sleeping performers and crew, and a caboose. But this wasn't a big concern. Automatic signalling used by the railroad warned that the line was blocked, and the crew of the circus train set up lanterns down the line as an additional warning. It was about 4 AM on the 22nd of June. Daylight was arriving, and the train crew were repairing the overheated axle box when another train came barreling towards them. It was an empty troop train, on its way to collect soldiers ready to be deployed into Europe to aid in the First World War. Men waved their lights to try and get the driver's attention, but the train just didn't slow down. Travelling at 35 miles an hour, the troop train collided with the rear cars of the circus train. The wooden bodies of the carriages and caboose were split clean in half, with some telescoped into others. The engine pulling the troop train derailed, but remained upright. As awful as the collision was, worse was yet to come. 2 things you must remember about these circus trains. Firstly, they were very cramped places to live, most people having to share a bunk, so a lot of people were crammed into these carriages. And secondly, they had kerosene lighting. Before anyone had the chance to realise what was going on, the lamps aboard ignited the splintered wood, quickly turning the wreckage into a bonfire, with many people trapped inside. A signal tower close by immediately called for help, and any circus crew that were clear of the wreck began trying to pull as many people free as they could. Trapped passengers screamed and begged for help, but there was little anyone could do to free them from the heavy burning wreck. It's reported that some of the victims trapped in the fire begged rescuers to shoot them to spare them the pain of being burned alive, but no shots were fired. By the time firefighters had arrived, most of the ruined carriages were ablaze and there was little to no water available to tackle the fire with. A wrecking crane was brought in to help clear the debris and free trapped passengers, but the heat from the fire was too intense to effectively use it. Relief trains carrying doctors and nurses came from Chicago, Gary, Hammond, Whiting, and other nearby towns to help, treating burns and taking victims to nearby medical centers. Despite making it out of the wreck, many victims succumbed to their injuries shortly after arriving at the hospitals. By 11 AM, the fire was fading, and locals had gathered to help in whatever way they could, with many more spectating the scene. Most of the circus passengers were trying to recover from the crash, with most still in their nightwear and some wandering around half crazed. By the time the ordeal was over, out of the 400 people aboard the train, 86 had died, with a further 127 injured. But it wasn't just crew and equipment that had been lost, but a massive part of a community. Many performers often formed deep connections among the people they travelled with, while some travelled with their families, either as part of their act or simply just to stay together. Chief Clown Joseph Coyle lost his wife and 2 children in the accident after requesting they come with him while on tour, saying he wished he'd died with them. Also among the dead were the Rooney family, Mayers family, Cottrell family, Donovan family, Robert Ellis and his wife, strongmen Arthur Deercooks and Max Knightsbor, and many more. It wasn't just performers either, as crew members were also lost to the fire, some having literally just joined or ran away from home with the circus. Some bodies were burnt so badly they couldn't be identified, while others were simply cremated in the blaze. An investigation was quickly launched to find out how the accident could have happened. Immediate suspicions were that it was the work of German saboteurs due to the war. An agent of Michigan Central stated that the driver of the colliding train must have been dead at the regulator to fly past the warning signals. But as it turned out, both the driver and the fireman were alive and well. Alonzo Sargent, the driver of the troop train, was swiftly arrested and questioned. He admitted he'd been awake since 5 AM the previous day, working on and off for nearly 23 hours and getting little to no sleep in between. Prior to the accident, he'd had a large meal to get him through the night, taken kidney pills, and had driven the engine for hours. Having followed mostly slow goods trains all night, when approaching Ivanhoe, he noticed the signal was set to danger, but didn't slow down, expecting the next one to be set to all clear, as was often the case with following slower trains. After closing a window to keep the wind out, the warmth of the cab and the rocking of the engine caused him to doze off and miss the signal ordering him to stop. By the time he'd come to his senses, he was already facing down the rear of the circus train. Sargent admitted he'd fallen asleep, but clarified he was otherwise fit enough to drive and had no intention of causing the accident. Both Sargent and his fireman were criminally charged in court, however, a hung jury resulted in a mistrial, and by 1920, the charges on both men were dropped. The show, meanwhile, had to go on. Local residents of Indiana donated food and clothes to the victims, and not long after, multiple circus troupes from across the country donated supplies, with their performers and animal trainers joining to keep the show going. As a result, the Hagenbeck-Wallace circus was delayed for only 2 days before it reopened, despite the casualties. Prior to the accident, the Showman's League of America had purchased a plot of land in Forest Park, Illinois, to be used as a cemetery for deceased performers, named Showman's Rest. 5 days after the accident, a service was held for 53 of the deceased victims, only 5 of which were ever formally identified. The rest either marked by their nicknames, their job, or simply as unknown male or unknown female. Not long after, the rest of the circus was sold on and eventually became part of the American Circus Corporation. What happened that night was truly an unmeasurable tragedy, and like many disasters, could have so easily been prevented. If a little more oil had been applied to the axle box so it didn't run hot, if Sargent hadn't been overworked, if he hadn't dozed off at the worst possible time, I suppose that's what makes it tragic. Let us take a moment then to remember those lost in this terrible disaster, and remind ourselves that there's a good reason you should never work while tired.